Imagine a land where the sound of war never stopped, where children grew up knowing only conflict, and where hope was buried under rubble long before it had a chance to grow. In the shadows of this chaos, two powerful forces began to rise, one promising order, the other planning destruction. This is the story of how the Taliban and Al-Qaeda took root in the 1990s, and how their rise changed the course of history far beyond the mountains of Afghanistan. After the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the country became a battlefield between Soviet forces and Afghan resistance fighters known as the Mujahideen. These fighters received support from countries like the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, who viewed the conflict as part of the broader Cold War struggle. For nearly a decade, the war devastated Afghanistan's infrastructure, displaced millions, and left deep divisions among different ethnic and political groups. In 1989, when the Soviet Union withdrew its troops, it did not leave behind a stable government or peace. Instead, various Mujahideen groups that had once fought a common enemy now turned against each other in a struggle for power. There was no clear leadership, no shared plan for rebuilding, and no agreement on how the country should be governed. This internal fighting led to widespread lawlessness, corruption, and violence. Afghanistan became fragmented, with warlords controlling different regions, each imposing their own rule. The central government was weak and often ineffective. People were exhausted by the violence and instability. In this environment, civilians, especially in the south of the country, started to look for a force that could bring order, justice, and safety. The chaos and power vacuum created the conditions in which the Taliban would emerge. Many of its early members were former Mujahideen or students from Islamic religious schools in Pakistan. These schools had been influenced by a strict version of Islam and had close ties to Pakistan's intelligence services. When the Taliban first appeared in the mid-1990s, they presented themselves as a movement that could end the civil war and enforce a form of justice. Their message gained quick support among people desperate for stability. The vacuum left by the Soviet withdrawal made it possible for this new force to rise rapidly and begin reshaping Afghanistan. The Taliban emerged in 1994 in southern Afghanistan, primarily in the province of Kandahar. Its members were mostly young Afghan men who had studied in Islamic religious schools or madrasas, located across the border in Pakistan. These madrasas were influenced by a strict and conservative interpretation of Sunni Islam, particularly the Deobandi school of thought. Many of the students, known as talibs, meaning students, were also former Mujahideen fighters who had participated in the struggle against the Soviet occupation in the 1980s. With no unified government in Afghanistan and local warlords fighting for control, the country was plagued by lawlessness, corruption, and violence. Ordinary people were suffering from extortion, insecurity, and a breakdown of justice. The Taliban rose quickly by promising to restore order and enforce Islamic law. Their initial popularity came from swift actions taken against criminal behavior and corrupt commanders. For example, when they captured areas under the control of abusive warlords, they would publicly punish those accused of crimes, portraying themselves as moral and just. Their leadership was largely composed of clerics and religious figures rather than professional politicians or military strategists. This gave their movement a religious legitimacy in the eyes of some communities. Armed and funded with assistance from Pakistan, and supported by some business interests and conservative religious networks, the Taliban expanded rapidly. Within months of their first actions in Kandahar, they began taking control of other provinces. Their military campaigns were often brutal, but they faced relatively little resistance because the Afghan population was exhausted by years of war. The Taliban filled the vacuum of power with a strict centralized rule that prioritized obedience, religious conformity, and harsh justice. Their interpretation of Islamic law soon became the foundation for the government they would establish in areas under their control. In 1996, the Taliban captured Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, marking a turning point in the country's history. By this time, the group had already taken control of much of the southern and western regions. Their arrival in Kabul followed intense fighting with rival Mujahideen factions who had controlled the city in the early 1990s. These factions had been engaged in a brutal civil war, which had devastated the capital and caused widespread suffering among civilians. When the Taliban entered Kabul, many residents initially welcomed them, hoping they would bring an end to the years of violence and disorder. Once in power, the Taliban declared the creation of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, a state governed entirely by their interpretation of Islamic law. Their rule was marked by extremely strict social and religious policies. Men were required to grow beards and attend prayers, while women were banned from working or attending school. They had to wear the burqa in public and could not leave their homes without a male guardian. Music, television, and many forms of cultural expression were banned, and public punishments such as floggings, amputations, and executions were carried out regularly as part of their legal system. These policies were enforced by the religious police who patrolled the streets to ensure compliance. The Taliban's approach to governance was shaped by a narrow, conservative view of religion, not by traditional Afghan culture or democratic principles. Their rise to power in Kabul also gave them political recognition from only a few countries, including Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Most of the international community condemned their human rights record and refused to establish formal diplomatic relations. Despite this isolation, the Taliban continued to consolidate their control, ruling over nearly 90% of Afghanistan by the end of the decade. Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, began developing its global network during the 1990s, and its relationship with the Taliban became a central part of its ability to operate freely. After being expelled from Sudan in 1996, bin Laden relocated to Afghanistan, where he was welcomed by the Taliban leadership. Both groups shared a deep opposition to Western influence, especially the presence of the United States in the Middle East. While the Taliban was primarily focused on establishing an Islamic state within Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda had broader goals that included launching attacks against Western targets and creating a transnational jihadist movement. In Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda found a safe haven. The Taliban allowed bin Laden and his followers to build training camps, operate communication centers, and organize terrorist activities with little interference. These camps became hubs for jihadists from across the Muslim world, offering ideological training as well as paramilitary instruction. Hundreds of militants passed through these facilities each year, many of whom would later be involved in attacks around the world. In return for this protection, Al-Qaeda provided financial and military support to the Taliban. Bin Laden used his wealth and connections to fund Taliban operations and help recruit fighters. Over time, the alliance grew stronger, not just strategically, but ideologically, with both groups reinforcing each other's worldview. Despite international pressure, particularly from the United States, the Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden or shut down the Al-Qaeda camps. They believed offering sanctuary was a religious duty and a demonstration of loyalty. This partnership became increasingly dangerous for global security. Al-Qaeda used its Afghan base to plan and execute high-profile terrorist attacks, including the 1998 bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. These operations marked the emergence of Al-Qaeda as a global threat and tied the Taliban directly to international terrorism in the eyes of the world. Throughout the 1990s, Al-Qaeda evolved from a relatively obscure group into a major force in global terrorism, with its operations becoming more ambitious and deadly. Under Osama bin Laden's leadership, the group focused on targeting symbols of American and Western influence, especially in the Muslim world. Al-Qaeda's ideology framed the United States as the root of Muslim suffering, pointing to U.S. military, bases in Saudi Arabia, support for Israel, and involvement in Muslim-majority countries. Bin Laden used these grievances to rally support and justify violent action as a form of jihad. From its safe haven in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda operated training camps, recruited followers, and developed complex plans for international attacks. One of the first major demonstrations of its growing reach occurred in 1998, when Al-Qaeda coordinated the simultaneous bombings of U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. These attacks killed over 200 people and injured thousands, drawing global attention to the organization's capabilities. The strikes were well planned and deadly, showing that Al-Qaeda could operate across borders with deadly precision. The United States responded with limited missile strikes on suspected Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan and Sudan, but bin Laden remained unharmed, and the core structure of the group remained intact. Al-Qaeda's confidence and visibility grew as it developed more cells and sleeper agents across different continents. Its message attracted recruits not only from the Middle East, but also from North Africa, Southeast Asia, and Western countries. The Taliban's protection made it difficult for international intelligence and law enforcement agencies to monitor or disrupt the group's activities. These developments set the stage for even more devastating attacks in the future. By the end of the 1990s, Al-Qaeda had transformed into a sophisticated and dangerous network with global ambitions and the operational capacity to carry them out. The Taliban's support for Al-Qaeda and its strict internal policies led to widespread international isolation during the late 1990s. While the group had seized control of most of Afghanistan and declared the Islamic Emirate, very few countries recognized its government. Only Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates maintained official diplomatic relations. The rest of the world viewed the Taliban's rule as illegitimate and deeply concerning due to its human rights abuses, especially toward women and ethnic minorities. Under Taliban rule, women were banned from working, denied access to education, and forced to live under restrictive conditions. Public executions, amputations, and floggings were carried out regularly, often in sports stadiums as part of their harsh legal system. The international community, including the United Nations, imposed sanctions and condemned the Taliban's behavior. Aid organizations faced increasing difficulties operating in the country due to restrictions placed by the regime. The Taliban's refusal to distance itself from Al-Qaeda made matters worse. As Al-Qaeda launched more attacks against U.S. and Western interests, global pressure on the Taliban intensified. Repeated demands for the handover of Osama bin Laden were ignored, with the Taliban claiming that they could not betray a guest under their protection. This alliance ultimately placed Afghanistan on a collision course with the rest of the world. Western governments, particularly the United States, viewed the Taliban not just as a repressive regime, but as an active enabler of international terrorism. As the 1990s ended, Afghanistan became a safe harbor for extremist groups planning violent operations far beyond its borders. The country's isolation deepened, with limited trade, diplomatic contact, or international cooperation. This environment allowed terrorist networks to grow unchecked, while ordinary Afghans continued to suffer under a regime that showed little regard for global norms or basic human rights. The rise of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in the 1990s was not just the story of two extremist groups, but a reflection of what can happen when conflict, instability, and fear are left unaddressed. In the vacuum left by war, promises of order and justice can take dangerous forms, especially when guided by intolerance and violence. The Taliban, born from chaos, enforced a harsh rule that silenced many and isolated Afghanistan from the world. Al-Qaeda, sheltered by this regime, turned the country into a launchpad for terror that reached across continents. Together, they shaped a decade marked by growing insecurity, human suffering, and the erosion of peace, not just within Afghanistan but far beyond its borders. Understanding this history reminds us of the urgent need for compassion, strong institutions, and the courage to stand against extremism in all its forms. It's a lesson in how deeply the choices of a few can affect the lives of many, and how important it is for the global community to respond with unity, wisdom, and a commitment to justice.